See this? See this thing right here? It takes up the whole screen. It's gone. This is my leg brace that I've been wearing for 11 weeks. Don't have to wear it anymore. Doc says not needed. But the doc did say, gotta wear this brace still. Smaller around the knee, probably for another 5 weeks, and then no more brace at all. So there you go. It's pretty good. Now, if I were employing the rule of threes in an article, I would start by saying more than 300,000 people tear their ACLs every year, requiring a brace to be worn around the knee. Cincinnati resident Fred Reeder had to wear his brace for 11 weeks until the doctor finally said he didn't have to wear it anymore. It feels great to get that bleep thing off my knee, Reeder said. That's the rule of threes. What's the rule of threes, you ask? I'm going to tell you all about it in this lesson today. Good to see you. You have a supplemental in files, so if you want to go there, I want to again say the reason why I do these videos is because it's essentially me doing what I would do in the classroom, but we get to do it in video form, which means you can stop me anytime you want. It also means we get extra time in class for you to work on your writing in class instead of doing it for homework, which means, and what's great about that is I'm right there and I can hobble-ish over to you and help you with your writing and answer any questions that you have. So it's going to bode well for the remainder of the semester since you have this news story to write and then a news narrative and a focus story to write. The more class time I can give for you to do that in class, the better chance you have of being successful. All right. So if you look at the supplemental that I put on files, you should have your textbook and access to the internet and Canvas. The first thing I do is I show you again a picture of the inverted pyramid of journalism, which says the who, what, when, where, why, and how are the most important things that have to happen right away in an inverted pyramid story, a hard news story where you're just presenting information. It's not an opinion piece. It's not a news narrative. So you want all that information immediately. If you go to your textbook, I want to look at the first or the early pages of the chapter on the inverted pyramid. For me, it's in chapter 9. It starts on page 170. This looks at talking about the lead, of trying to get that information about the basic questions. And then the more questions there on the right under tips on page 171 says that the second section is the so what, which needs to be answered very soon. And then the what's next is the final section. So your overall structure will look like that. On page 172, or I'm sorry, at the bottom of page 171, the author starts to talk about this fire that started. Henry Smith is a smoker, and there was a fire in his house. And those 2 pages walk you through some struggles that this writer has of finding the true so what. It's really not so much as these pages say that the fire was started by a smoker who was careless and there was a little bit of damage. That's really not that big of a story. Most people would read it and just say, I don't really care, I'm moving on. But the editor was able to help the writer realize that really the most important thing is that it was the 8th fire caused by smokers, and that's twice as much as last year, and that's now we're getting something with a little bit more meat to it. And so that's your job with your story. Most of you went to the Keith O'Brien talk. Is okay, this guy came and he talked about this book that he wrote. Big deal. Who really cares about that? You might have been saying the same thing yourself. But there's a more serious or more weighty issue, I guess, that you could write about in your lead. And that is the tease that you want to provide to readers, is that this was more than just a talk about a book. What's the bigger issue? And my hope is that you see in the Me Too era that this talk about women empowerment, about a time in our society when, not that long ago, 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago, when women were dismissed, were considered too weak, and were not presented anywhere close to being equal to men, how this resonates with what's going on today. So that's something you want to think about as you work on your so what question. If you look on your back to your supplement under Roman numeral 1, I say that's the most important question you need to answer very soon is so what. Our attention spans are short, and if we're not interested, we're moving on. And true, most people won't be incredibly enthralled with this story. They probably will feel about it about the same way you might have felt about it, or most of you felt about it. And I find it fascinating. I can't wait to read the book. Maybe you feel the same way, maybe you don't. But as a writer, you got to try to sell it and make it as interesting as possible. And that so what question is the question. Let's look at an example, Roman numeral 2, about an inverted pyramid story. So if you click on that link, go to that story, you'll see it's short. It's written by Samantha Brunn back in September. You have the who, city council, you have the what, voted unanimously against rezoning a parcel comprised of 2 areas. You have the when, Tuesday, September 18th. So you have the who, what, when. We don't have the where, although it's in Oxford, and if Samantha would have had a date line, then we would have had the where. And then the big thing is the so what, and the so what happens in that first sentence, that it deals a blow to the development company who intended to redevelop the area. So she's trying again to provide a reason for you to write the story. And as you go through the story, you'll see some things structurally. Number one, notice the short paragraphs. We've talked about this all semester, 1 to 2 to maybe 3 sentences. I also want you to see the internal structure of this, where all the quotes are introduced with some information or maybe some paraphrasing. So about 5 paragraphs down, it says Councillor Chantal Ragu, maybe, asked the representative what would happen to those plans if the upzoning proposal failed to pass. And then there's a quote. Then there's another paragraph where the Oxford mayor is paraphrased about what the council is open to talking about. And then there's a quote from the mayor right after that. Oh, Annie's playing the piano. That's Annie. You hear that? Anyway, and then finally you'll see at the very end of the article the what's next, that there's a city council meeting that was going to be held on Tuesday, October 2nd. All right, so that's the overall structure, and we'll get into more of that as we go along. Let's look at the assignment. If you go to Files on Canvas and then click on the Class News Story Assignment. You've already done the before the event. You've already done the at the event. So let's look at what you have to do after the event. And I've asked you to interview 2 people who have attended the event, so you should have done that right away. And you're trying to get a few quotes from each person about those key topics or angles that you covered. You should have gotten that person's name, title, information, so we'll know who that person is, and some contact information as well. Let's look now at the class news article rubric in Files. This is what I'll use to grade you. This shows you the requirements, that it's an inverted pyramid structure. The story is between 600 and 750 words. You need a headline. We'll talk about how to write headlines. You need a picture along with a full cut line. You need your byline, a date line. You need to have interviewed 2 people. You need hyperlinks, and then you need contact information. So that gives you a nice checklist where you can just mark off, yep, I did that, I did that, I did that, all the way down. And then you'll notice that the paper is provided in soapstone, or the rubric is provided in soapstone structure. I'm not going to read through all this, but you need to go through it and see that you are providing a clear subject in the proper structure of what, so what, and what's next. For occasion, that you are clearly letting us know the when and where. Audience, we're going to write this for a national audience, so people have no clue where Miami is, Oxford, none of that. So when you say where this event took place, you can say in the John Dalebois room of Shriver Center, but a national audience doesn't really care about that. And so if you're writing for the Miami Student, you would just say, you would give that specific information. For your story, you can just say spoke on campus, and that's good enough. The purpose, you cannot add your opinion in this. So you can't say that the talk was interesting or fascinating or illuminating or boring or dull. Your job is not to provide any sort of adjectives about the event. Delete the adjectives. Now the people you talk to can talk about whether they liked the event or not, but you cannot do that. Speakers are the people who are in the story. You want to clearly identify them along with the facts. And then the tone should just be a straight news story tone. No slang, no formality. You're allowed to use contractions. Um, and then under other items, what am I going to expect out of the headline? What I'm going to expect out of the photograph, which let's talk about that now. You should have taken a picture, just an action photo of the event. And then you need a cut line with that. The cut line needs the who. So if you went to the O'Brien event, it would be author and journalist Keith O'Brien. The what, speaks, you want present tense, speaks at Miami University about his new book, and then you name the book. That's the who and the what. You need the when it took place, and you need the where, so you can just put on campus. And then I would like more information than that. So you need some information about the story, like for instance, a specific topic he talked about. And then you need a quote, either from him or from a student that you interviewed. So it's a pretty full cut line. We'll talk more about what that cut line should look like in class, but if you want to go ahead and start to write one, then I can look at it during class either Monday or Wednesday and give you the thumbs up on whether you have enough information for that. You also need hyperlinks. We'll talk about that in class as well. If you don't know how to do hyperlinks, I can show you how to do that. Okay, so that's the rubric that I'll use to grade you. It's out of 75 points. That takes care of Roman numeral number 4 on your supplemental, which is the photo, what you need. And then Roman numeral 5 is getting your information organized. That's what I want to talk about last. See, we're almost finished. If you haven't looked at the announcement that I made on Canvas about getting your information organized, then please take a look at that. The key with internal structure is, and what's critical for journalists is that you have to back up what you say. You can't just make stuff up and without any sort of evidence or background. Now, politicians do this all the time. They just say stuff without any sort of evidence. You can't do that as a journalist. You need to have examples and quotations to back things up. So let's look at Roman numeral 6 on the supplemental. Letter B under Roman numeral 6 says that you must back it up. You want to start back up information. You want to start with your fact or topic, and then you're going to provide evidence and a quote to back that up. This is called the rule of threes. I've talked about this a little bit before in class. 3 is a magical number in literature and religion, and it certainly is here structurally with how you write stories. There's really no magic to writing news stories. It's all pretty formulaic, which is nice. So even amateurs like you who aren't used to writing news stories should be able to pick this up pretty quickly and be effective in how you present it. And I know you're sitting there thinking, oh gosh, I don't care. This all has to deal with your life. You're going to have to go through presentations, interviews, all sorts of things where people are going to ask you about topics, and you better have evidence to back up what you have to say, and you better have an opinion about those things. So you need to follow the rule of threes. If somebody in an interview for a job says, tell me about your academic work, then give a fact. Just say, I'm on the dean's list. I've been on the dean's list every semester. And then give an example. For example, in my journalism class, I had a 98% in that class, and the professor told me that I was one of the best students he's ever had. So there you had a fact, dean's list, an example, your percent in that class, and then a quote that my professor said I'm one of the best students he's ever had. There you go. That's the rule of threes. That's how it works. So I said to practice here. So if we practice letter C under your supplemental, let's say you're a reporter for the Chicago Tribune and you're writing a story about population growth in Chicago. Let's say you got wind that people are complaining about the growth, or there's issues maybe with traffic or with infrastructure, and so you uncover a fact. You uncover that the suburbs of Chicago have seen a 26% growth in population in the past 10 years. I totally made that up, but let's just say that's a fact. Your next step is to find an example that shows this growth. So you might want to talk to people who live in Evanston or Lincoln Park, is it? I think that's where my sister lived for a little while. Naperville. I don't know if that's really considered a suburb, but you would talk to people who live in the suburbs and ask them about traffic. And maybe you head up to Evanston and you find out from people that, yeah, it's a madhouse up there trying to get home, trying to get to work and trying to get home from work. And you interview one guy named Ryne Sandberg. Cubs fans will know who that is, who agrees that it's bad. And you get a quote from him saying that it's unbearable. It's gotten to the point where I might look to move. There's your rule of threes. You've now created an internal structure in your story with a fact, with an example, and with a quote. So move down the page, and here's how that would look. The paragraphs would look when you put them together. Typically, you put the fact and the example together. Suburbs of Chicago have seen a 20% growth increase. And then the example in Evanston, for example, traffic at rush hour can cause 1 hour delays. And then separate from that, you want the quotation from the person. It's unbearable, Ryne Sandberg said. It's gotten to the point where I might look to move. All right, so what you want to try to do is have more than one sentence for a quote. You try not to end it with attribution. It's a lot more powerful to end the quote when you have the words of that person versus the name of that person, the attribution. Please notice also with the attribution that you have the name and then the word said, how that looks. Also start to notice the punctuation with the comma after it's unbearable, and then the period goes after the attribution, since that is officially the end of the sentence. Also notice that the quotation or the comma is inside the quotation mark, so is the period. Always, always, always. Here's another example from what I provided in announcements. So if I were writing this Keith O'Brien story, this is exactly how I would have written it, with a fact that he provided context on what life was like for the women in the 1920s. And then he gave examples of life for women there, so I gave a few examples of that. And then a quote that I've totally made up, of course, from Sally Smith. Notice there's a quote from her, then an attribution from her, and then another quote from her to bookend this. As your book says, if you have long quotations, more than one sentence, or a really, really long sentence, you need to break that up by putting the attribution early so readers know who's actually talking. Because if not, if I didn't put Sally Smith until the very end of all those sentences, people could think that it's Keith O'Brien who is doing the talking. So you want to identify the speaker as soon as you can. All right, almost finished. Next, if you can't get to three, the rule of threes, if you can't have a fact and then an example and then a quote, then at least get two. Get your fact and topic and then provide a quote, which I do in the example. The suburbs of Chicago seen a 26% growth, and then I get a quote. Notice I've identified the person first, and then provided the quote from him. The next would be if you can't get all three, and let's say you can only get a fact or a topic, you can only, and then you only have an example for support. You weren't able to interview somebody for some reason, or maybe you couldn't get the verbatim quote, so you have to paraphrase. And then there's an example there. The suburbs of Chicago have seen a 20% growth, 26% growth, and then the example is Ryne Sandberg, who says that the traffic is causing 1 hour delays, and for some reason you just didn't get a quote from him. All right, so now's the time to review your information. What did I get out of the event that I went to? Do I have topics? Do I have examples for support that O'Brien gave? And did I get quotes from either O'Brien or from the people who attended the event for support? If you don't, as I put here at the end of the supplemental, then guess what? You need to look for examples for support online. Or if you don't have enough interviews, then you need to call that person back up that you interviewed. Maybe talk to somebody new who you know went to the event, if you're able to do that, and get some quotes for support. Again, these are things that we can work on during class. The more that you can do now, the more comfortable you're going to feel in writing this story, the more that I can help you on Monday and Wednesday when I go around the room to see your progress and push you toward a successful paper. So try to work on this as much as you can, as much as you feel comfortable with at least, to get some semblance of a story going structurally. And that'll help you this week, and it'll take some of the pressure off too, since I know you have an observation due Wednesday. All right, that's all I have. Hope you're having a good weekend, and I'll see you Monday. Bye.